Hello, fellow readers and booktubers. This is my nonfiction November book tag. I was tagged initially by Pat from Book Chat with Pat, and I think this tag or these prompts originated with Bookish Travels. And I was reading through, there's 9 prompts, and I was thinking about them, and I brought up some interesting thoughts that I'd like to share with you all now. So the very first prompt is, or the first question dealing with nonfiction books is this: what motivated you to pick up your first nonfiction book, and can you remember it? I can remember it indeed, and it was quite a long time ago. Before I tell you what that book was, I need to put it in some context regarding my own personal life and kind of the general cultural context of the United States at the time. This was a book that was published in 1968. And I believe I might have read it around that time. Well, probably 1970, somewhere in there. So I would have been freshman, sophomore in high school by that time. Now, at that time, science fiction was being taken very seriously. The age of Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers was over, and now we get these science fiction writers such as Arthur C. Clarke and Isaac Asimov, Ray Bradbury, Philip K. Dick, who were writing a different kind of science fiction, a more serious science fiction. And of course, the original Star Trek series it was never really big on the ratings, but it did garner a very solid and faithful core fan base. I was kind of part of that. I was very young at the time, but the point is science fiction was being taken very seriously, unlike ever before. And pretty soon Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey would hit the theaters. So it was a very different time. Also, the first moon landing had taken place, and there would be 5 more to follow. It was a historic event for sure. There was a very serious interest in UFOs at the time. The first UFO flap, as they used to call it, occurred in the 1950s, and then after that, people were always talking about it, and occasionally there'd be an article in the newspaper. Someone saw some strange lights in the sky, and then there were the occasional stories of people who claimed to have been abducted by aliens. So that was very much part of the culture and on people's minds. And at the same time, there was a growing suspicion of the government, of the church, of religion, of societal values, of institutional structures and tradition. And with that suspicion began an age of conspiracy theories. The more far out and bizarre, the more likely they were to be embraced by the most number of people. All this starts in the late 60s and the early 70s. And into that maelstrom came this book. Now, I don't have the original copy of the book. I had a paperback copy of it. I don't know whatever happened to it. I'm sure it was given away at a garage sale or maybe at the local library or something, and it's been a very long time. So I had to go on to Google and click images to try to find an image of the original cover of this book. And apparently the book is still in print, and the cover has changed and has been more dramatic or muted down a little bit. But I did find a Google image of the original cover as I remembered the book. Although this is only a black and white image, but nonetheless, are you ready? Chariots of the Gods by Erik von Däniken. Now, some of you might be familiar with this, and if you're not familiar with this book, you're certainly familiar with the ideas that were presented in this book as they permeated the culture and even created a little cottage industry. This was the book that presented to a very broad audience the theory that the Earth had been visited by space aliens thousands, maybe tens of thousands of years ago. This was the idea that during prehistoric times, or among the most ancient of civilizations like the Egyptians and the Sumerians in Mesopotamia, or the Aztecs or the Mayans in the Americas, had been visited by space aliens who had imparted to the human race incredible knowledge and an understanding of things and taught us all kinds of magnificent skills and in some cases actually built monuments to themselves for us to worship. This was the theory behind this And this just caught on like wildfire. It seemed to fit in, or it seemed to feed all those cultural things that were lighting up at the time. Space aliens. You can't trust the institutions. What's the true story of the past? The big question, of course, is who was Erik von Däniken, the author of this thing? Well, he wasn't an historian. He was not an archaeologist. He wasn't a philosopher. He was essentially a failed entrepreneur, and perhaps a criminally a guilty entrepreneur at that. He had started a number of businesses. He had been charged with embezzlement and fraud. He was a con man, essentially, but a con man with a flair for the sensational, and apparently a pretty good writer. I remember reading this book and thinking, oh my goodness, this is remarkable. And the picture included all kinds of maps and photographs of images that claimed to show. I remember one in particular. It claimed to show it looked like a Native American, like a hieroglyph type thing, and this image of a human seemed to be in some kind of narrow little confined space, as if he were in a space capsule. Of course, that was the claim. Okay, and not long after this book was published, and it hit the bestsellers list, and von Däniken became a household name. But it took a couple of years, but eventually serious scholars and historians and archaeologists and anthropologists began to respond to some of the claims in this book, and quite frankly, it was like shooting fish in a barrel. Everything von Däniken said, he was either employing pseudoscience or misrepresenting things. The images and photographs in the book that claimed to show evidence of visits from space aliens, these photographs were manipulated. They didn't have Photoshop back then, but they could still manipulate images pretty well. The images were doctored, or you'd only see part of an image, or it would be shaded in a particular way. Sometimes it would be some kind of obscure-looking image. I remember a couple of them from an Egyptian tomb. It was a hieroglyph, and in the background of the sky, there seemed to be an image up there. Oh, that's a flying saucer coming in for a landing. But what von Däniken was doing here was the power of suggestion. It's kind of like if you look at the clouds in the sky, someone can say, doesn't that cloud look like an elephant? And you'll look at it and say, yeah, it does look like an elephant. Then someone else can come along and say, wait, that very same cloud, it looks like a battleship. And you'll say, oh, I see that now too. It's that power of suggestion. So he's showing you these images that are pretty innocuous, or that do have reasonable explanations. And you say, no, it's a spaceship. And so you're seeing a spaceship. And some of the images, as I said, were just completely doctored. So this was, the whole thing was a fraud. It was kind of silly. But even at that young age when I read this, and this would have been my early teens, some of this stuff just didn't quite make sense to me. I'm not claiming some special insight or intelligence, but as soon as the books started to come out that challenged von Däniken's claims, I began to read those as well. And the challenges were quite effective. The impact that this nonfiction work, maybe I should put nonfiction in quotes here, that Chariots of the Gods had on me was not the intention that von Däniken was hoping for. He was hoping to sell a bill of goods, but instead what it did for me is it sharpened my critical sense. And it's something I've carried with me ever since. Critical thinking skills are so important, especially in the world today. And it also sparked an interest in ancient civilizations. I didn't want the silliness, but I want the real story, or I want to know what historians and archaeologists really thought of these past civilizations. Where's the scholarship? Where's the true evidence? And that eventually would lead me on to a career in history, in the serious study of history. So anyway, that was the book. One of the things that's always interested me about this book, it's been a long time now, but its ideas have so permeated the culture that a lot of people take this as a simple fact. Of course there were space aliens that visited us. No. Even now, there's all these TV shows and videos and things on YouTube about ancient astronauts and all of this. And yet there are the more serious scholars, who keep fighting back against this, making very little headway, because von Däniken's ideas spread very quickly. It reminded me of that quote from Mark Twain: A lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is still putting on its shoes. I like that a lot. It kind of captures the whole thing. Before I move on to the next prompts, I was looking at the original cover here, and it's a very sensational thing, and there are all these provocative questions on the cover of the book that the book claims to answer. And I thought maybe those of you who are not familiar with this, I would help to save you some time by answering these questions for you in my position in society as an historian. So the big question here at the top, right here, I don't know if you can read that, is, was God an astronaut? No. Then another question, did astronauts visit the Earth 40,000 years ago? No. And then another question, is there evidence of a prehistoric airfield in the Andes? No, not really. And then, did extraterrestrial beings help set up the giant stone faces that brood over Easter Island? No, they did not. So that should save you some time. Prompt number 2. The next question. I hope I haven't offended anybody out there. I know there's a lot of people that believe in this stuff. God love you. If you want to comment, be kind. Number 2, how do you choose your next nonfiction read? This is the kind of question that comes up a lot in prompts for various tags on BookTube. How do you choose your next book, your next novel, your next nonfiction book? And my response is pretty much the same as anyone's response would be, whatever attracts my attention at the time. Sometimes I try to follow a bit of a blueprint. I'm going to read this, and that will tie into this other book, and then I'll read the other one. But then another book will blow through the door or something. A bright, shiny object will attract my attention. I'll drift off into something else. So I don't really have a set plan as to what I'm going to read next. Certain topics will attract me, and I'll stick with that for a while, for a few tomes, and then I move on to something else. Do you take notes or annotate your nonfiction books? I do, but very carefully. I don't like my books to be all marked up, although I do have a couple of boxes filled with paperback editions of books that I use for study in undergrad and graduate school. Those are all marked up and almost impossible to read now. But what I'll do with a book that I'm reading now, and if something leaps out at me, I'll put a little check mark in the margin of the book. And then when I finish reading for the day, or when I finish reading the book, I go back and I look for those little check marks, and I'll read what's there, and that will trigger my memory as to what that passage meant to me at the time. And I keep a little notebook, and I'll make notes in that notebook. So I do annotate my books a little bit, okay, but not too much. Have you read a nonfiction book that has challenged your beliefs and assumptions? I think, yeah, most of them. And that's why we read nonfiction. We want to become a little better informed about certain things, and we want our ideas to be challenged, not necessarily attacked or changed, but just to get us thinking more deeply about particularly assumptions that we might have about things. I can give you one specific example, though, of a book that I read that did change my beliefs or my understanding of something, very powerfully so. And that book was by Finley, The World of Odysseus. All right. This book was published quite a few years ago. It's a classic work in the study of ancient Greece during the Greek Dark Ages and into the Archaic period. And Finley is studying, the myths and legends and the actual civilization of Greece, before its golden age. And it's a wonderful work. It's really very, very interesting. But there are a couple of appendices to this book that Finley added over the years. And one of them has to do with the subject of Troy and the Trojan War. Since the late 1800s, there's been a belief that Troy was discovered. There was a German banker and part-time archaeologist, Heinrich Schliemann, who used Homer as a guide. In Homer, Homer describes Troy, and he mentions certain geographical landmarks, certain hills and mountains and rivers that still exist along the coast of modern-day Turkey. And so Heinrich Schliemann went there, and he studied some other sources, and he found the ruins of an ancient city. And then about 20 or 30 years later, there was a more serious archaeological expedition, and the headlines were, Troy has been discovered. Now, of course, they didn't discover any giant wooden horse or any, no signs like, Hector slept here, nothing like that. But it seemed to be that there was a city, and it was about where Homer said it was. And a lot of archaeologists studying these ancient ruins and these ancient foundations made some pretty spectacular claims. And one of the claims was that there was evidence here of a siege mentality. That was the term that was used. And of course, the story of the Trojan War is the city had been laid siege to for about 10 years. Well, here was this ancient city, and it looked like there had been a siege of the city because there was evidence of that kind of mentality. Also, evidence of purposeful destruction, as if this city had been purposely destroyed. Now, here's the issue with this, and this is the challenge that Finley came up with. Finley considered these claims, and I believe he actually went and visited this ancient city himself. And he said some of these claims are rather dubious, maybe just wishful thinking. First of all, if there was a Troy, and I believe there was, we're looking at the ruins of a city. If this city that we look at and say, well, that's Troy, this is over 3,000 years ago, maybe even longer ago than that, right? And so Finley asked in this book, what is the evidence of a siege mentality? What could that be? What are you looking at? And the archaeologists would point to, it seemed like there are these subterranean receptacles where you could keep grain and olive oil and things like this. He said, well, that's a siege mentality. They're surplusing these things because the city was under siege. Finley says all ancient cities have that. They always keep surplus material because food and the possibility of famine was a very real thing in the ancient world. So that's not really evidence of a siege mentality. And then the other claim was evidence of purposeful destruction. Well, a city over 3,000 years old is not going to be in good shape. And also in the Eastern Mediterranean, earthquakes are very common. They have been common for thousands of years. So certainly the walls of a city that had been abandoned for whatever reason, or even one that was occupied, the walls would start falling in from time to time. And then there's the weather and erosion and tsunamis and everything else. You can't look at a city over 3,000 years old and say, oh, look, that was purposely destroyed, without adding the conditional remark that, or it may have just be falling apart because it's just so old. So Finley said maybe not. So after reading this book, I had to reconsider how I teach the history of ancient Troy. I used to teach that there does seem to have been a Troy, and it looks like it was destroyed in some conflict at about the time Homer suggests it was. But with Finley now, I have to really qualify those remarks and say, well, historians once thought we had found the city of Troy. There is an ancient city on the site, but whether that's Troy or not, maybe not. Don't want to burst anyone's bubble, but the prompt here was there a nonfiction book that challenged your beliefs and assumptions? And this one did challenge my beliefs and assumptions about the Trojan War. The next prompt was, how do you feel about the intersection of storytelling and factual content in nonfiction? I had to stop and think about this one a little bit. And I didn't quite know how to answer it. Storytelling and nonfiction. And I realized the problem was with how I was defining nonfiction. When I think of nonfiction in its general definition is just anything that isn't fiction. So that would include science and its many subcategories, astronomy, geology, physics, medicine, biology, and even books like philosophy, theology, books on political theory, essays about current events, commentaries on movies and books. All of that is nonfiction, and a kind of what was the storytelling techniques, a narrative technique doesn't really work with nonfiction like that, but it does work with history, and it does work with biographies. Some narrative histories are the most popular of all. Now, the field of history can be very specialized at times, and so specialized that the casual reader has no interest in what some historians talk about. Some historians will discuss everything from the diet of prehistoric man to how the Prussian army, the uniforms of the Prussian army in the late 18th century. That's very specialized stuff. The more popular kind of history is narrative history, and it does use fiction techniques. I think one of the most popular narrative historians today is Erik Larson. He currently has a book where he essentially tells the story of what was going on in the country leading up to the Civil War. I don't have that book, but I do have one of his earlier books here, In the Garden of Beasts, which tells the true story of an American diplomat in Berlin as the Nazis came to power. And it's a true story, real people doing real things, but it's told as a narrative. It has a narrative drive to it that just pulls you right along. There's another book by Adam Higginbotham, Midnight in Chernobyl. I believe this was made into a series on HBO, perhaps, or a series based on this book. Again, a true story about the meltdown at the nuclear power plant in Chernobyl. And all the facts are there, and he doesn't embellish, at least not as far as I could tell. However, it's written like a novel. It's very exciting. It's distressing and edge of your seat kind of stuff. So I guess, the prompt about how do you feel about the intersection of storytelling and factual content and nonfiction, I'm fine with it. Provided, of course, one caveat, if you're going to write a history of something and you're going to use a narrative technique, stay within the lines. Or if you're going to include some conjecture or try to creatively reconstruct a conversation that may or may not have taken place, you've got to alert the reader to this. You can't say, this is what Roosevelt said to Churchill, if it's only what you think Roosevelt might have said to Churchill. You've got to say, Churchill might have said something like this, if you don't actually have some kind of record of the conversation. I hope I make myself clear on that one. But I don't really have a problem with storytelling in nonfiction books, provided it's done properly and with guardrails set up. Is there a topic you wish authors would explore? Yes, indeed. I think, some books have addressed this. It's this the impact of social media, not just on people's lives, but on our ability to recognize truth from falsehood. And we're on the eve of an AI generation, which could really impact us in some very powerfully negative ways. I wish more nonfiction books would address this and explore this and research this, because I think we're already feeling the impacts of this. People becoming incredibly confused, and the more confused people become about what is truth and what isn't truth, the more likely they are to embrace what isn't truth. They'll embrace the sensational. They'll embrace like von Daniken's book, Chariots of the Gods, was kind of the precursor of this thing. And I think you can see this with this country's response to the COVID crisis. It was a real thing, and it was deadly. And yet a lot of people were confused because of what they're reading on social media. So you get this anti-vaxxer thing, which will be the death of us. I think the best explanation for why a would-be dictator, why a demagogue like Donald Trump can get away with saying and speaking the nonsense that he speaks, the reason he gets away with that is because people are confused. What's the truth? Maybe what he's saying is true. It isn't. But this comes right out of social media, and AI is going to make it 1,000 times worse. And I would just like to see some nonfiction writers really start investigating this and publishing and sounding the alarm about this, or, like I say, it will be the death of us. I don't want to end on a grim note like that. And I don't have to, because the next question or the next prompt is, do you incorporate insights from nonfiction into your daily life? Absolutely. I don't know as how you can not be impacted by anything you read. But when it comes to nonfiction, I read a lot of history, but philosophy and all those other areas of nonfiction. And ultimately, if you read a lot, as I do, as I think many of you do, if you spend at least an hour a day reading every day, eventually this stuff seeps in and it shapes your character. And I think the more you read, the broader your understanding is, and the broader your understanding, the more tolerant you are of other peoples and cultures and other ideas. And the more tolerant you are, the more humane you become. So yes, the things I read do get incorporated into my life, sometimes intentionally, sometimes not, but it's all there. And I think it's true for all of us. We are what we read. It's kind of a modification on the old expression, you are what you eat. That may or may not be true, but you are what you read. So choose one book from your nonfiction collection to highlight. Yes, I've got one right here if I can find it. Here it is. This is, I just want to make sure I get the date properly. This was a book that was written in 1766. Voltaire's The Philosophy of History. Voltaire, of course, is the great French leader of the French Enlightenment, a very iconoclastic thinker in his time, and even in this time, a very forward thinker. He would even be regarded as a forward thinker today. Voltaire's was a prolific writer of books and essays, and he was a correspondent to many of the royal houses of Europe in his lifetime. This would have been in the late 18th century. But for some reason, it's very hard to find his books in English translation. And my high school French just isn't going to cut it for this. So whenever I find an English translation of one of Voltaire's works that I'm not familiar with, I snatch it up right away. And so I grabbed this. Voltaire, even though it's well over 200 years ago, he's got a very modern or even postmodern sensibility about him. And he's a very humorous, witty author. So, and a good nonfiction book. I'm interested. I know more about Voltaire from books written about him than I do from his own writings. So I'm very curious. I know a little bit about what his philosophy of history is, but I'm very interested in reading it in his own words, translated into English, of course. So there's my nonfiction book. Tag some people. What I'm going to do here is I'm taking a cue from Reading This Life. MJ will occasionally post the YouTube channels of people who don't have a lot of subscribers, kind of encouraging all of us to start to subscribe and pull in new members to the community, the book reading community. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to tag some people who don't have much in the way of following, and I'm going to tag them so they can read these prompts. And sometimes when people become members of BookTube, and if they don't get a big following, I think they get kind of despondent, and then their content starts to dry up pretty quickly because they think no one's listening to them. Well, hopefully these prompts will attract their interest and attention, and they'll start posting them, and I'll be happy to see what they have to say about all of these things. So that's all I've got for you today. I think I may have said some things that it was not my intention to offend those of you who are waiting for the space aliens to come and save you. Maybe they will, but it wasn't my intention to offend. This is an open forum. We can express our ideas freely, and we are all readers of books, which makes us all more prone to be more patient with each other and more humane. So if I offended, my apologies. Keep reading, stay strong, and I'll talk to you all later.